chapter 14. Talking about God being the possessor of all. Remember, we mentioned this wide-eyed moment that we had. And some of the things that causes us to have these wide-eyed moments. And we left off with Lot essentially having this moment. And looking out over Sodom and Gomorrah and the plains there, where all those things, all this stuff was at. And thinking to yourself, oh man, what I could do with all of those things, right? So just a quick recap, Abraham and Lot, now this is that ended up being quite the stampede of people and livestock and all kinds of stuff, so they, a little more than they were able to even, they had more resources and things than they had space, essentially, so Abraham and Lot kind of decided they were going to split up to keep horses and cows and things for fighting for food and water, and just all the different kind of, I guess, day-to-day tasks that would be difficult if you didn't have enough land or grain or space or anything of the sort. So they decided to split up, and Abraham had told Lot here that wherever he wanted to go, he could, and Abraham would go in the other direction. And we saw Lot looking around and seeing Sodom and Gomorrah and the plains there and the possibilities of all of the wealth that he could garner by looking there and where he was at there in chapter 13, and kind of being very, very selfish in his choice, being very, very selfish in thinking that he could get more and more things and be blessed with more and more stuff. So he decided to go in a certain area, and we see that over in chapter 13, the land that Lot was looking at was compared to the Garden of Eden. It was compared to Egypt, of course, the Nile River, the Fertile Crescent there. So it would have been a very, very, the possibilities would have been endless there. Let's put it that way for Lot. And Abram went the other direction. And as we finished up last week in chapter 13. Abram had just went in his direction and had settled down and had built an altar to worship God. And we see Lot kind of out of the picture, but we don't see him doing any type of altar building or sacrificing unto God. He's more concerned with kind of his own wealth and his own self and being much more selfish. Okay? So at the end of chapter 13, we have the separation of Abram and Lot. And Lot there again with the wide-eyed moment looking at the possibilities before. Abram building an altar, to sacrifice to the Lord. Because Abram, in his wisdom and knowledge, understood that God was the possessor of all these things. That it may look appealing to Lot what he could do, but God essentially owned all of that and exponentially infinite amount more. And Abram understood that, and Lot did not. And that's where we left him off at. So we jump into chapter 14, and we see that Abram has to come to Lot's rescue because of some of the things that are going on. Okay? So what I want to do is let's read the first 16 verses of chapter 14, and we'll go back in and talk about some things within these verses as well. But let's read the account here first. And it came to pass, Shedelamir, the king of Elam, Tidal, king of nations, that these made war with Bera, the king of Sodom, and with Bersha, the king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemabir, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zor. All of these were joined together in the vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea. 12 years they served Shedlamir, and in the 13th year they rebelled. And in the 14th year, when Shedlamir and the kings that were with and smote the Rephaim and Ashtaroth, Karnam, and Zuzim, and Ham, and Emam, and Shaveth Hirathim. You all don't seem too impressed. I feel pretty good about myself. Yeah, I feel pretty good about myself, but I just managed to get through. Verse 6, and the Horites in their mountains of Seir unto El Paran, which is by the wilderness. And they returned and came to Mizpah, which is Kadesh, and smote all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites, and dwelt in Hazazon Tamar. And there went out the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, the same as Zor, and joined battle with him in the vale of Siddim, with Shedorlaomer, the king of Elam, and with Tidal, king of nations, and Amraphel, the king of Shinar, and Arioch, the king of Elasar, 4 kings with 5. And the vale of Siddim was full of slime pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there, and they that remained fled to the mountain. And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah, and all their victuals, and went their way. And they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. And there came one that had escaped and told Abram, the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, and brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abram. And when Abram heard his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued him unto Dan. And he divided himself against them, he and his servants, by night, and smote them, and pursued them unto Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot, and his goods, and the women also, and the people. Okay, now, we see here that after Abram and Lot had divided, we see once again an instance in which we don't really see God in the foreground of what's going on, but he is providentially behind the scenes, kind of orchestrating things. Okay? We see his involvement kind of in the background, when allowing these things to happen. And there's those 16 verses, we don't see him mentioned anywhere in the book, right? There's complete omission of it. And that's the omission here the omission of God being there, or the activity, is kind of setting the stage here for Abram to kind of teach Lot and to also teach us, the reader here, this lesson in continuing to help Abram's growing understanding that God is in fact the possessor of all. Right? So, in the first 16 verses of chapter 14, we see these 4 kings. Okay? Now, these 4 kings are in the area of what we now know of modern Iran. So when you see the king of Elam, that's modern Iran. Shinar is modern Iraq. So it kind of gives you the area of where this is going on. And they've taken the people of the plain of Jordan here, the Jordanian plain, and the southern part of the Dead Sea, which included Sodom and Gomorrah. And the kings have come in and put them under tribute, put them under siege, or have them part of their kingdom and part of their captivity. Right? Verses 1 and 2, we see that. Shedorlaomer, the king there, had taken these nations and made them kind of his own. All right? So, and if you continue to case for 12 years. So for 12 years, these nations were under the tribute of King Shadorlamir, and he was in charge of them. They were paying tribute to him. And in the 13th year, they didn't want to do it anymore, so they rebelled. 14th year, they had to do it. All right? So this rebellion triggered a war of the 4 kings of the east that we saw in the first part of the chapter. Okay? And the war here led by King Shadorlamir of Elam, and if you look down verses 5, 6, and 7, 14th year came the king, and they were with him and smote them, right? So in the midst of the 14th year of this war, the king Shadorlamir and his armies invaded and defeated the people who were in rebellion here. Okay? The armies then turned back to the north and attacked the Amalekites in Kadesh Barnea before continuing more northeast, to go towards the rebellious kings who lived just a little bit south of the Dead Sea, right around in the area of where Sodom and Gomorrah was. All right, so as we read down through verses 4, 5, and 6, and 7, we finally get into Kadesh there, verse 8, toward the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they're going in and pretty much just whipping everybody is what's happening here. Okay? The roundabout path here that this king took was probably to ensure that the direction that he took his army was probably to ensure that nobody would be able to kind of come at them from the rear or be able to kind of attack them elsewhere. That's why he went on this path. That's why the account is here in the way that it is, to show us this kind of sweeping attack and sweeping victories over all these kings. Okay? The kings of the east here are, as we saw, victorious when they get to the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, verses 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, and especially down in verse 11. Let's go there. And after they have conquered the king of Sodom and Gomorrah, what did they do in verse 11? They conquered them, and then they took all their stuff, right? They took all their stuff from them. So all the stuff that was important, they went in and just took all of it. All their victuals, and went their way. And in the midst of all that, in verse 12, what else did they take? What does it say in verse 12? Well, they took all Lot's stuff too, right? So they took all the king's stuff, they take all of Lot's stuff, which tells us that they took the kings and then took Lot's, that Lot had what? Had stuff, right? He had lots of it. And they see him, this was just a guy that was there, that had his farms and stuff had set up, and they see him and realize he got some important things, some valuable things as well. It kind of shows you here kind of the wealth that Lot had at this time. So, as the cities are being plundered, as Lot is getting his stuff taken from him, and they take the stuff up to Dan, which is north of the Sea of Galilee. The king of Sodom, and both these kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, as we saw, they managed to escape, right? And that's down in verse 13. And there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew, he dwelled in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite brother of Eshcol, the brother of Anar, and he's from Abram. So all this has just happened. Okay, Lot's got his stuff taken. The king of Sodom and Gomorrah, their kingdom had been captured, their stuff had been taken, and they had just managed to escape. Abram now then hears about all this. So he hears this whole account that we just read in the first part of chapter 14. This guy manages to get out, manages to get to Abram and tells him what's going on. And as Abram is there and listening to all this went down, all that just happened, and say that we're there and we're part of Abram, we're one of Abram's workers, right? We help Abram with whatever, cows, cattle, whatever. See this guy come running up to Abram. How is an observer of watching Abram hear this news, and how as an observer would we expect Abram to respond to the capturing of Lot considering Lot's choice and how selfishly he had taken the well-watered land that was close to Sodom and Gomorrah, what would you, as an observer of Abram, kind of expect Abram to do? If you were maybe giving Abram some advice, what I managed to escape. King of Sodom and Gomorrah, they managed to escape as well. And Abram looks at you and says, what do we need to do? Would be maybe a pretty common response.
Some people might say, well, it's his own fault.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people would say that. I think it would be a pretty common response. He shouldn't have went there. You gave him the choice and he wanted to go there. Maybe even suggest that Abram just stay put, right? And not go risk his life and his men's life and the time and resources it would take to go and rescue Lot. Maybe the risk was too great to even think about going and rescuing Lot. These four kings had come in and pretty much wiped out everybody and showed their strength and power. So I imagine that the suggestion of staying put, not going after him, would probably be, and that thought probably even crossed Abram's mind some. He was the one who decided to go there. But as we see in verse 15, that after he heard about his nephew's capture and what had happened, what does Abram do in verse 14? What does he do? What's his response? Personal army, right? He goes and he finds his own personal army. He manages to muster up 318 people. Okay, 318 men he manages to his own personal army, loyal associates of Abram, and they go and pursue after these other armies up to Dan. Right? When Abram heard his brother was taken captive, verse 14, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. Okay, so he quickly comes up with 318 men. Now, was Abram's army comparable at all in size to the enemy's army? No, by no means, right? It was dwarfed a whole lot. 318 men probably wasn't really much to sneeze at compared to the army that had just taken Sodom and Gomorrah stuff and Lot stuff and all that, right? So we see that, first of all, insurmountable odds here of this army who was going after Lot. But Abram knew that it did not matter if he would roll into the army or into this battle by himself. He had God on his side. He knew he was going to be victorious. Okay? It was not the size of his army. It was the fact that it was the size of the God that he was serving, essentially. He knew that. And so he gets in verse 15. And he divided himself against them, he and his servants by night, and smote them and pursued them unto Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. So Abram attacked the invading armies in the middle of the night, and he did so by splitting up the 318 men into two divisions and attacking them from two different fronts. Okay? So Abram here is a good farmer, he's a good businessman, he's a good family man, and he's also a pretty good general, right? He's also a pretty good general. Abram kind of a total package, able to do all of it. Again, because of his faithfulness to the Lord. So the men, his 318 men, were successful in defeating the kings of the east, right? We see that verse 15, that he pursued them unto Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus, and he's successful in fighting them, as we see in verse 16. And not only does he go and is he successful in defeating these armies, he also goes and takes all the stuff back. Okay, so he goes and all the goods, verse 16, brought back. And he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother-in-law and his goods, and the women also, and the people. Okay, so Abram freed Lot. Freed Lot's family, recovered the goods as well as the goods that belonged to the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. What do you think Lot said to Abram when he knocks on the door, pulls back, I guess, the curtain on the tent, and comes to rescue him? What do you think Lot may have said to Abram when he showed up to set him free? Any idea? You just didn't know. What would you think Lot's response would be?
Should be grateful.
Probably very grateful, obviously. Anything else you think you might have said to him? Think there was an I'm sorry moment at any point? I would imagine that initially, I'm sorry. I can kind of see that happening. You think Lot learned any lessons here, though, from this scary experience? Knowing what's coming in the future? Lot really learned a lesson? No, probably not, right? Probably didn't really, because Lot eventually does what? What's Lot going to do here the next few weeks? Or right back in, right? Actually, not just, now he's not going to sit up on the outside, right? He's even more and more entrenched in it. So he probably doesn't really learn much of a lesson here. Now, it's worth noting that all this happened at the kings of both Sodom and Gomorrah. At no point did they ever lift a finger to help Lot. Okay? They initially, they fled the battle. Then they decided to stay home while Abram embarked on the dangerous 120-some miles, I think, he had to trek, rescue mission. You would think that, in Lot's case here, that he would realize that the lack of loyalty from these kings to him would push him towards a deeper affection towards his uncle Abram. But of course, that's not the case. When we get to verse 17, we see that once again, after Abram's kind of come to the rescue here, he recognizes God as the possessor of all. So go to verse 17. The king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Shedlamir, and of the kings that were with him at the valley of Shuvah, which is the king's dale. And Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him, and said, Blessed be Aaron of the Most High, God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. And he gave him tithes of all. And the king of Sodom said unto Abram, Give me the persons, and take the goods to thyself. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread, even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich. Save only that which the young men have eaten in the portion of the men which went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take up their portion. So as Abram here returns from defeating these kings, he's met by the king of Sodom and this mysterious king of Salem, Melchizedek. And Melchizedek is a player that we're going to kind of talk about a little bit later on because we've not seen him at any point up to here. Now he's here, and he shows up, and we don't see anything about his birth or his death recorded anywhere in Scripture, which is kind of unusual, especially for the book of Genesis, because every major character that kind of plays a part is recorded in here somewhere. And the way he shows up, the unique presentation here of Melchizedek, David mentions it over in Psalms. The writer of Hebrews kind of mentions it as well, because there's some significance to Melchizedek. It's not important to us at this moment, but it will become important to us in a little bit. Okay, so Melchizedek's here. He shows up with the king of Sodom, and there's several different people there who kind of helped in the battle as well. Okay, now back back to Melchizedek for a second. If we go and look at a map from this time, there's a bunch of different areas called Salem. There's a whole bunch of Salems during this time. It's possible, if a couple things that I have read, that actually probably pretty likely, that Melchizedek was the king of Jerusalem. If you look over in Psalms chapter 76, it kind of mentions that. And Jerusalem, could have been shortened to emphasis the name to Shalom, which can be translated as Salem, and Shalom means peace. So there's a lot of things. Melchizedek's an interesting character that we'll kind of talk about a little bit later on. But anyways, he's here, he greets Abram, and he's got this feast, or got this meal set up for him. And as we see in verse 18, Melchizedek also is described as a priest of the high God, the Most High God, right? So Melchizedek, the king of Salem, is here, priest of the Most High God. And this is the first time that we've seen any mentioning of a priest referenced in the Bible. Nowhere else have we kind of seen this. So that's Melchizedek now in here. He's a character now that's kind of in this, and we're going to talk a little bit more about him later on. Right? So as we go down through the rest of the chapter, though, as he's kind of talking to Abram, and Abram is talking back to them, we see a couple of different instances that there are a couple of descriptions of God that are repeated a couple of times. Right? So verses 17 all the way down through verse 24. What do we see that's mentioned, or what do we see, or how is God described a couple of times? Most High and the what? There's another one, the possessor of heaven and earth. Right? Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth. So we see that description several times. And Melchizedek reveals things about God through his blessing of Abram, right? He goes in and said that God is the owner of everything. God was the one who brought about Abram's victory. God was the one that brought Lot out of this captivity, essentially, because of Abram's faithfulness. So as he's blessing Abram, he's revealing more and more about God's character to Abram and to us as the reader as well. And then we have Abram's response to Melchizedek's blessing as well. And that would be in verse 20, right? So he's been blessed, all these things, and then verse 20 it says, "And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies in thy hands." And he gave him what? What did Abram do? He gave him a tithe, right? So he had these things, and Abram tithes, essentially. Gives him his tithe here. That was his response. Of the offering of all the goods and the plunder, essentially, to God through Melchizedek. So we see Abram kind of giving back here. So Abram's actions demonstrates that he understands Melchizedek was a legitimate representative of God here. Okay, and we had to give the tithe. Giving the tithe to Melchizedek was a way for Abram to give God the credit for the work in securing the victory, rather than trying to take the credit all by himself. Maybe embarrassed by Abram's courageous and willingness to pursue and fight the kings of the earth, the king of Sodom here made Abram an offer as well that would have made him quite a bit wealthy. We see that in verse 21. King of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the person to take these goods for myself." The king's offer here to Abram was in the form of a kind of a command, but it showed the weakness of his own position. A strong king would have demanded that all of the goods be returned to him along with the people. That's not what the king of Sodom does here. He says, "Take the stuff," and giving a few people back. But Abram, as we see at the verses 23 and 24, the end of this chapter, refuses the offer, refuses to take the goods, "that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latch," he says in verse 23, "that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich." And Abram doesn't want to take it because he doesn't want to give the king of Sodom any type of credit at all for the stuff that he would have given him. He doesn't want that to happen in no way whatsoever. Abram, again, by not taking anything, using these gifts one more time is trusting in God more than trusting in his own self. He is trusting God for the provision because Abram understands God is the possessor of all things. Okay? While up front, right in front of his eyes, it looks like the king of Sodom has wealth beyond comparison. Abram understands and knows that God's provisions were far greater. Okay? So Abram tells them that he doesn't want it. He allows them to kind of essentially take their things back. But it kind of shows again one more time, teaches Lot and teaches the lesson here that God is essentially the possessor of all things. Okay? So that finishes us up for chapter 14 and for lesson 6. And the little thing here for lesson 6 was focusing and continuing to focus your affections on God. Next week, we'll jump over into chapter 15. And next lesson goes 15, 16, and 17. And we kind of continue to look at God's promise, and God's promise of children to Abram kind of comes into play, and some of the doubts and fears and things that kind of happen with that as well. So that's what we'll be looking at next week. And Hagar comes in, and all the stuff that kind of happens from there. So that's where we're going with chapter 15. Again, starting next week. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the lesson that we had here, Lord. Thank you for the continued faithfulness to Abram. Because Abram was being faithful to you, but how you continue to provide for him and continue to take care of him, Lord. And again, because of his faithfulness and obedience to you, Lord. And it should be a reminder, a constant reminder to us as well that sometimes the things that are sparkly grab our attention and take our focus off of you. We see the present now, how much things maybe how good things could be, or whatever the case may be. And sometimes allows us or causes